If you're grinding for a 170 right now, you're giving up your weekends, you're paying for prep, sitting the test over and over, I've got to tell you something nobody who runs this test will. The 170 you're killing yourself for is not worth what it used to be. The LSAT got easier several different times, leading to rising LSAT medians. And there's only one move left on the board that's still yours, which I'm going to get you to. But first, you've got to see the whole board. For 20 years, a 170 meant the top 2.5% of everybody who took the LSAT. That wall did not move. Then, in the last few cycles, it slid up to about the top 5%. So the number of people clearing a 170 roughly doubled. And that is not supposed to be possible, which right there is the tell. The LSAT is equated. It's built on purpose, so 170 means the same thing every year, no matter who is in the testing pool. That held for about 2 decades, and then it broke. And so either every pre-law in America got dramatically smarter at the exact same time, or the number got hollowed out from the inside. This is how law school admissions inflated its own scores and why the machine that did it is now running with nobody's hand on the wheel. Now, I'm not saying that anybody sat in a room and plotted this out. That's not the story. Every single one of the changes to the LSAT had a reason, like the pandemic, a lawsuit, reasons of access and convenience. So the story is that the system is rigged, but not rigged by people. It's rigged by incentives. Every one of these changes did end up, though, pushing your score up, and not one of the people who made the changes loses a thing when scores inflate. Now, when the incentives all point one way and nobody's penalized for following them, you don't need a conspiracy because the structure does the work, and that is what is rigging the system today. The first thing was the pandemic. LSAC never undid some of those changes. In 2020, they couldn't open up test centers, and so they shipped a remote version of the LSAT and did a couple of things to it at the same time. They cut one of the scored sections. They went from 4 sections down to 3. They also removed the unscored experimental section as well, the temporary LSAT flex format. And so the people who used to fall apart in the final hour of a 5-section grind stopped falling apart. The pandemic, of course, ended, but LSAC kept all those changes anyway for longer than perhaps they needed to. Then in August 2024, due to a lawsuit, LSAC removed the logic games section, and they replaced it with a second scored logical reasoning section. For background, in case you're not aware, there were 2 legally blind test takers who sued and for the removal of logic games because they contended that they couldn't benefit from drawing diagrams the way other test takers could. So this is not a villain story here. It's really a civil rights settlement, but the effect on scores was real nonetheless. Logic games was one of the great separators or differentiators on the LSAT. A lot of people cratered their scores because they couldn't handle it. Others got perfect scores, and so it was a great distinguisher or separator along that spectrum of 120 to 180. And so you swap logic games for a second scored logical reasoning section. The consequence is it's easier to get a top score because there's less material for you to study. Another big change to the LSAT is that they went from offering it only 4 times a year to 8 times a year. So you've got more attempts. They also removed some of the LSAT retake limits. And considering that only your best LSAT take counts, that means more incentive to retake, more people getting higher scores. And so if you take the LSAT 3 times, the worst 2 vanish, and you post a number that you might have never hit had you only taken it once. And about a quarter of takers at least retake the LSAT. So you run that across the entire population, and all the medians drift upward. You've also got accommodations. Approvals went from about 46% in 2012 to roughly 98% in 2022. Now, LSAC's own research from a 2017 paper found that accommodated scores tend to predict higher first-year law school grades than the students themselves go on to earn. Of course, they also moved the LSAT into your house. It used to be stressful in person at a testing center on paper for decades, from the start of the LSAT, of course, several decades ago, and then they moved it to at-home remote for the pandemic and have maintained the at-home version of the LSAT until this coming June, which will be the final in-person administration with rare exceptions. Of course, taking the LSAT at home with webcam software is not the same as taking it in a room with human proctors. I'm not saying that cheating's everywhere. Nobody has clean numbers, and most people take this honestly, but there is an opening of vulnerability that some folks have exploited, which is part of the reason LSAC is going back to in-person for almost everybody starting in August. And so lots of different reasons, lots of different changes to the LSAT, but all pointing in one direction, making it easier to get top scores on the LSAT. Now, the extra time accommodations thing is a separate issue, so I want to treat it separately, and I want you to notice that. I've made this argument before, and I've gotten a lot of pushback on this one. And the pushback and the feedback I got was good enough that I want to answer all of it here. What I'm not saying is that nobody's faking. I'm not alleging widespread fraud here. But there are some people who I suspect are taking advantage of the ease with which you can get extra time accommodations. And they are casting a light on those who deserve accommodations and casting doubt on them. If LSAC's answer to nearly every approved request is the same, giving the people more time, they're not really individualizing anything here. They're defaulting. It's like a factory setting. Extra time is right for some conditions and it's the wrong solution for others. But if they just give everybody extra time, you get the same over-prediction that LSAC has found. Because the fix, the solution, is not really matched to the need, and that's a failure of the institution. I'm not blaming any individual student for this. Now, some people say the argument that I'm making here hurts the students I claim to care about because disabled students already live in an impossible bind. If you ace it with accommodations, you're called a cheater. If you struggle and take it without accommodations, you're not getting a good enough score. And that's an impossible situation. You're between a rock and a hard place. And I think it's an imperfect solution. There's no perfect solution here. But schools are sensing that some scores run high with no way to see which, and so the doubt smears everybody the same. The sloppy measurement is what is manufacturing that label where some folks get called cheaters. But bottom line, though, we do have this issue where scores are rising across the board and nothing's going back anytime soon. Now, LSAC, of course, they run the test. You're paying for every time that you take it. They've roughly doubled the number of times you could take the LSAT each year and loosened the retake cap. And so now a quarter of those taking the LSAT come back to take it again. Now, LSAC is, of course, a nonprofit, so I'm not going to say they're profiting directly, but a nonprofit does still run on revenue, and they're still growing. They still answer to their budgetary needs. And so offering it more times means more money coming in through the door. They are not a neutral party. The schools also want higher medians for their prestige and for their yield, and they get that with the fact that they can report only the highest score on your record. Now, for years, the biggest reason law schools chased LSAT medians was the U.S. News rankings. Then in 2023, a bunch of top law schools boycotted the rankings, and so U.S. News reduced the weight of the LSAT. It's now down to about 5% of the formula, with more weight dumped onto the bar passage rates and employment outcomes. But the thing is that LSAT scores predict law school grades and bar passage rates, which then carries over into employment. And so LSAT scores are still either directly or indirectly a massive part of the U.S. News rankings. And the thing is that even with law schools boycotting the rankings, the medians have kept climbing regardless. Even in just a single year, the LSAT medians jumped nearly 2 points across the board on average. That's going from a 168 to a 170 or a 170 to a 172. It's pretty significant. The inflation is not even chasing any single incentive anymore. It's a structural change. The LSAT being shorter, the endless retakes, the reporting of the highest scores, the removal of logic games, every one of these factors keeps increasing the number up on its own long after the original reason for it stopped mattering. No one's even steering this thing and it's still accelerating. And so logic games is not coming back. That's due to a court settlement. Nobody's re-implementing the retake limits. No one's ever going to reflag accommodated scores, nor should they. You don't fix a machine that runs on itself and it costs its owners nothing to ignore. It's the floor now, and it's why the percentile numbers are only moving one way, and that way is up. And so if you want help getting your LSAT score up, because that's the only variable in this whole game you still control, your GPA is already fixed, your work experience is what it is, the LSAT is the only number that you can improve at this point, most likely, unless you're still in high school, in which case, focus on your college grades, focus on getting into college. The LSAT's the biggest needle you can still move. And so if you want my help getting your LSAT score, I've got a lot of free resources for you. I'm also offering a free LSAT tutoring lesson for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free tutoring lesson with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well.